Thank you for joining us in Legacy Hall to hear from one of our dynamic speakers, Dr. Georgia Purdom. Dr. Purdom earned her PhD in molecular genetics from Ohio State University. She's won various academic awards and taught biology for 6 years at Mount Vernon Nazarene University before joining Answers in Genesis. Now, even with her impressive scholarly background, she's a wonderful speaker, as you'll discover in a minute. An active researcher and writer, Dr. Purdom also directs our popular women's outreach, Answers for Women. You can find her resources, including DVDs of past women's conferences, in our gift store. At this time, please silence all cell phones. And note that emergency exits are located up front, to your right and left, and along the left side of the room. Now, let's give our full attention and a warm welcome to Dr. Georgia Purdom.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon and to talk about eugenics, abortion, and our future, the quest for perfection. And I want to talk a little bit, first of all, about eugenics, because that may be a term that you're not very familiar with. So let me start by defining what eugenics is. It was actually a term that was first coined in 1883 by Francis Galton. And Galton is actually considered the father of eugenics, and he was a cousin of Charles Darwin. Now, Darwin obviously is the father of evolution by means of natural selection. And we're going to discuss a little bit later a very robust connection that we have, not only between Galton and Darwin, but between eugenics and evolution. So eugenics literally means being good in birth or well-born. So being born with certain desirable characteristics as defined by a particular society or group of people. So most societies would define it as being born without any defects, right? Healthy, fit, or being born with certain characteristics like light hair and blue eyes. Okay, so that's the idea of eugenics, or being good in birth. Now, the practice of eugenics was first brought to national attention in the U.S. in 1915 with the case of baby Bollinger, and a newspaper reporter really recorded these words upon seeing the baby. He said, "A pink bit of humanity lay upon the white cloth. Its blue eyes were wide open. Its hair was brown and silky. It dug at its face with little fists. It cried lustily as it drew up chubby legs and kicked out. It seemed quite vigorously informed with life." Okay, so this, just by reading that, you would think, well, this sounds like a wonderful little baby. But it was noted also that the baby had deformities, all right? So, but it, just different things that were wrong just by looking at it that they could tell. But it was not questioned that a simple surgery could actually save the baby's life, okay? Because it had some intestinal issues that needed to be fixed. But this child was sentenced to death. Why? Because the doctor that was in charge, Dr. Harry Hull Selden, did not want to perform the surgery and actually convinced the mother to allow the child to die. All right. So why did this happen? Well, the doctor in charge said this: "There is no doubt the child would be defective mentally and morally if allowed to live. It might be criminal. Certainly it would be dependent. It would be a burden to itself and to society." And sadly, many other doctors agreed with him. He was tried in court for murder, and he was found not guilty. Right? And a reporter asked him at the time, "Is this a common practice among doctors?" And he replied, "Not infrequently." All right, so this was being done on a regular basis. So instead of doctors saving lives, right, they were actively destroying them. And it might be easy to think, okay, this obvious disregard for human life, at least when it comes to life outside the womb, is a thing of the past, and things have changed. But have they? In 2004, a doctor from the Netherlands published what he called the Groningen Protocol. And it was basically a series of statements that doctors and parents, he said, should consider when they decide about euthanasia for a newborn. Okay, and if they could, in other words, justify euthanasia for a newborn. And so the parts to this Groningen Protocol, they said that parents and doctors should consider euthanasia if the newborn has no chance of survival, if the newborn requires intensive care to survive with a poor prognosis and very poor quality of life, And they should consider it for infants for whom there is no hope in the long term and who in the eyes of the parents and the medical team are suffering unbearably. Now, when I read these statements, and hopefully you can see this too, they seem rather arbitrary, right? Because, for example, who determines what a poor quality of life is? What does no hope actually mean? Who determines what unbearable suffering is? And how would you even really know any of these things with any kind of certainty for an infant, right? A newborn is what we're talking about here. And from a Christian worldview, are any of these things really even relevant, all right? Because regardless of the infant's disease or deformity, we're talking about a fellow image bearer, right? A human being that is made in the image of God. And honestly, where does it stop, right? Because as you proceed down this list, right, it keeps broadening as to what infants this applies to. And I can almost guarantee in another few years, there'll be 4, 5, and 6, right, of this protocol about who should be euthanized once they're born. And so we need to realize that eugenic ideas are alive and well in the present. So in this presentation, what I want to start with is by discussing the history of eugenics and how evolution really provided a foundation for that, essentially the roots, so to speak, of the tree of eugenics. And then we want to understand how that in turn provided a foundation, eugenics did, for abortion and for Planned Parenthood, okay, that is actively, very active in our current society. So this is necessary to really understand the role of eugenics in the present, okay, because we need to be prepared for what's coming in the future, okay, because this hasn't stopped. It's going to continue. So I want to start with the history first, okay, and then we're going to talk about what's happening now with this. So the goal of eugenics is really to create a superior race of human beings. And Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, who was the founder of the Race Betterment Foundation, said this: "We have wonderful new races of horses, cows, and pigs. Why should we not have a new and improved race of men?" And you may recognize that name, Kellogg. Yep, that's the same one. That's for your breakfast cereal, okay? That's the same. I mean, he was the person who started this foundation. And many eugenicists really believed that the principles that were used in breeding animals should also be applied to man because, in their opinion, man was an animal, right? If evolution is true, we're nothing more than an animal. And so eugenicists definitely believed in evolution. Leading eugenicist Paul Popenoe said this: "There are only 2 ways to improve the germinal character of race, to better it in a fundamental and enduring manner. One is to kill off the weaklings born in each generation. That is nature's way, the old method of natural selection, which we all agreed must be supplanted." So what he's basically saying is natural selection isn't working fast enough or good enough, okay? So we have to do something about that. He says, when we abandon that, we have but one conceivable alternative, and that is to adopt some means by which fewer weaklings will be born in each generation. The only hope for permanent race betterment under social control is to substitute a selective birth rate for nature's selective death rate. That means eugenics. So this is basically the self-direction of human evolution, okay? In other words, people will decide, right? We won't let nature decide. We'll decide what should happen. So they believe that things like charity in the form of taking care of the poor and the sick were actually prohibiting natural selection from working properly, right? Because we are saving the people who might have disease and be defective rather than letting nature take its course and letting them die, okay? So they would think that's a bad thing for us to take care of them and to allow them to live. Margaret Sanger, obviously the founder of Planned Parenthood, said this: "Organized charity itself is a symptom of a malignant social disease. Our civilization has bred, is breeding, and is perpetuating constantly increasing numbers of defectives, delinquents, and dependents. My criticism, therefore, is not directed at the failure of philanthropy, but rather at its success," right? So she's upset that we're taking care of these people and allowing them to live. So the eugenicists really sought to intervene and use artificial selection, which we're going to talk more about how they did that a little bit later, and to effectively counter what doctors and Christians and others were doing to take care of the poor and the sick. They wanted to bring man back to what nature intended so man could evolve and progress. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier that Francis Galton was the father of eugenics, and that was in the late 1800s. But eugenics was practiced long before our modern times. It was even part of Roman law. So this was the law of the 12 tables, which said an obviously deformed child must be put to death. And both Plato and Aristotle supported this practice. It was not uncommon for infants to be exposed or left outside the home for a period of time to determine if they were fit enough to survive, because they only wanted the fittest for their future warriors, okay? So these things were going on long before the 1800s. But I want to fast forward to Galton because he is considered the father of eugenics. And I want to explore further the foundation for why he thought the way he did and why he promoted these ideas of eugenics. I want you to listen to what Galton wrote to Darwin, okay? Now keep in mind they're cousins. After reading so Galton's writing it to Darwin after he read Darwin's Origin of Species, which is his seminal book on evolution by natural selection. So Galton said this: "I have laid it down in the full enjoyment of a feeling that one rarely experiences after boyish days, of having been initiated into an entirely new province of knowledge, which nevertheless connects itself with other things in 1,000 ways." So he's going to take what he read in Origin of Species, which talks about the evolution of animals, okay, from single-celled organism up to not quite to mankind, okay, and we're going to talk a little bit later about Darwin's next book that dealt with that. But he's going to take those ideas. He said, well, if this happens to animals and humans are animals, well, let's apply it to animals, or let's apply it to humans. He's going to apply those mechanisms of evolution specifically to man. Galton said the creed of eugenics is founded upon the idea of evolution. He said eugenics must be introduced into the national conscience like a new religion. It has indeed strong claim to become an orthodox religious tenet for the future, for eugenics cooperates with the workings of nature by securing that humanity shall be represented by the fittest races. What nature does blindly, slowly, and ruthlessly, man must do providentially, quickly, and kindly. So again, we get this idea that, nature isn't working fast enough or well enough, right? We have to intervene, okay? We have to do something to make this better. Galton said, could not the undesirables be got rid of and the desirables multiplied? So he promoted the ideas that things like human intelligence and other hard to measure traits, such as behaviors, were greatly influenced by heredity, okay? Not by environment. That was really the mindset of the day, that your environment impacted who you were, how you became, how you grew up. But he was saying, no, it's in your, he didn't know about DNA, right, at that time, but it's something you inherit, okay? That he knew it was something like that, or he felt it was. So his book, Hereditary Genius, was published in 1869, and it was really the first social scientific attempt to study genius, and Darwin really liked that book. He says, Darwin wrote to Galton, "I have read only 50 pages of your book, but I must exhale myself, else something will go wrong with my inside. I do not think I ever in all my life read anything more interesting and original, and how well and clearly you put every point." All right, so that had a great influence then on Darwin and the ideas that he presented in his next book dealing with evolution called The Descent of Man in 1871. Okay, so this is what Darwin wrote. So you can really see, and this is just some of the quotes, okay, you can really see how their ideas, they're feeding off each other's ideas here. So this is what Darwin wrote in The Descent of Man. He said, "Thus the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals would doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It is surprising how soon a want of care, or a care wrongly directed, leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed." Okay, so you can see Darwin was clearly saying, yeah, go eugenics. He likes those ideas. He wanted to promote those ideas. Now, interestingly, February 24th, 2021, just yesterday, was the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Descent of Man. And there was an article that was written about this that explored the connection between Darwin and Galton and our current cancel culture that we live in. And the author of the article said this: "We live in and febrile times in which historical giants are subject to reassessment and in some cases removal from the public sphere, so-called canceling. Darwin offers praise to his half-cousin Francis Galton in The Descent of Man, and Galton's ideas about intellect permeate Darwin's thinking. All right, so in other words, that's what I've just showed you through those quotes. They're feeding off of each other, and their ideas are causing other things to grow out of that. And it's clear from their writings that both these men were racist and they were sexist, all right? Now, I haven't shared all of that with you, but they are, and you can read that for yourself. So shouldn't they be canceled, right? Because in our current culture, you got to deal with this now, right? Charles Darwin himself, right? They're thinking, should we do this to him? Should we do this to Galton? They've got to think about that if they're going to be consistent. So the author goes on to say, in 2020, Galton, a scientific genius and committed racist and eugenicist, had his name removed from a lecture theater and professorships at UCL, which is most closely associated with his work on eugenics. No one sensible is calling for the canceling of Darwin. Oh, yeah, see, they're not going to be consistent, right? They'll cancel Galton. They did cancel him effectively, but not Darwin, even though Galton built his eugenic ideas off Darwin's evolutionary ideas and vice versa, all right? They just kept permeating, kept taking these ideas and building more and more on them. So I think this really shows you how much Darwin is revered and worshipped even today and how inconsistent people can be, right, in our so-called cancel culture. So the concepts of evolution are really, as you see very clearly, the foundation for eugenics, that man can evolve into something better and higher if we just get rid of the undesirables and increase the desirables. So I want to move, though, from Europe to America, right? Because Galton and Darwin are over there, so to speak, across the pond. So what was happening over here in America at the same time? Because even though eugenics got its start in Europe, it really was never well funded, so it never gained much popularity. So leave it to the USA to put money behind it, right? Because that's how it got popular, in all honesty. So the eugenics movement in the US started in the early 1900s. It was well funded by well-known philanthropists like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Kellogg. There were eugenic societies, there were conferences, there were research institutions, there were scientific journals, and you can even major in it in college, right? They had departments, they had courses at the university level. And so it was well funded and well thought of here in the US. And there's two main categories that eugenic practices fell into, because I want to talk about how did they accomplish this, all right? So we know what they want to accomplish and why. Now, how do they do it? And that is through positive and negative eugenics, all right? So positive eugenics, the idea is to increase the fit, all right, to increase the desirables. And that was done through promoting the marriage of the well-born and promoting them to have lots of kids, okay? So one of the ways that they would get the word out about this, because you have to remember they didn't have Facebook, okay, and things like we do today, right? So they would go to county fairs because these were very popular with people of the day. That's where they got their entertainment a lot of time. And they would have eugenic exhibits. Now, in the bottom photo there, it says some people are born to be a burden to the rest. Every 7.5 minutes, a high-grade person is born in the United States and will have the ability to do creative work and be fit for leadership. About 4% of all Americans come within this class. Okay, so that means a lot of us are in trouble, right? We're not in those desirable classes. They even would have fitter family contests, okay? And so they would give medals to people. And so the question you might say is, well, how did they decide who was the fittest, right? What do you use for that? And they would look at a number of physical and or mental or behavioral traits. Almost every trait that you possessed was considered to be inherited, okay, that you received. So it wasn't just your environment that was causing you to be like you were, it was something you inherited. And it's actually similar to what we hear a lot of scientists saying today, that we don't have a soul or a spirit or no free will. We're just a bag of chemicals that's directed by our DNA, okay? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But those same ideas are still very much present in today's culture. But positive eugenics was not nearly as popular in the US as negative eugenics. And so negative does the opposite. It decreases the unfit or the undesirables. And so that was done through prohibiting birth, and that was done through birth control, sterilization, and abortion. Segregation was another way. So that was done through marriage and immigration restriction laws, and institutionalization of the unfit. So I'm gonna break all these down for you so you can understand a little bit more about that. So in 1911, Henry Laughlin, who was a leading eugenicist, and a committee from the American Breeders Association, now that has to do with animals, okay, but they're going to apply it now to man. They had meetings to decide what defined the socially unfit or the undesirables, because you've got to have some criteria, right? If you're going to say these people shouldn't multiply and these people should, how do you decide that? And so they had 10 groups of socially unfit. So the feeble-minded, the pauper, the inebriate, criminals, epileptics, and the insane. And when they say epileptics, it's not like we use that term today. That basically means anyone that had seizures, and anyone that had migraine headaches, anyone that had fainting spells, okay? It was a very broad category to which they put people. And you think about it, pauper, that's just someone that's poor, right? So it's not just about, again, things that we would not necessarily associate with being inherited, but they did. Seventh, the constitutionally weak. Eighth, predisposed to specific diseases. And then the deformed and those with defective sense organs. Okay, so very, very broad categories. Darwin himself was very sickly throughout his lifetime, so he would be considered constitutionally weak. Right? So Darwin himself should have been eliminated on the basis of this, in all honesty. And although it's not stated in the list, those of races other than the Caucasian race would also, by the mere fact of their ethnic background, be placed into one or more of these categories. Now, I use the term race kind of in scare quotes because we don't use that term here at Answers in Genesis, because we believe what the Bible says. And the Bible says we're all one race, okay? There's not multiple races. There's ethnic groups, there's people groups, but there's not multiple races, because we all go back to Adam and Eve. Now, these are very broad and vague categories, okay? There's no indication of degree that you needed to qualify as being unfit. And it's very similar to sort of the broad categories that I shared with you at the very beginning when we talked about the Groningen Protocol to determine if an infant should be euthanized. And if you think back to the case of baby Bollinger, not a lot has changed in 100+ years, right? We're still doing the same kinds of things today, sadly. So the eugenicists believe that 10% of Americans would fall into these broad categories. So they were known as the submerged 10. And again, all of these traits were thought to be heritable, and eugenicists wanted to develop programs to get rid of them. Okay, so even the fact that you were poor, right, or the fact that you drank a lot, or you were constitutionally weak, maybe you were sickly, it was all inherited, right? That's all it had to do with. So one of the ways they did this was through forced sterilization, right? So in 1907, Indiana enacted the first sterilization law. 30 states then followed, and we know of at least 60 to 70,000 people that were forcibly sterilized between 1900 and 1970. Okay, so when think about that. Most of you in this room can remember 1970. Okay. That this was still going on. There are even it hasn't come out so much recently, but even 10 years or 20 years ago, there were people finding out that they had been sterilized and they didn't even know they had been sterilized as a child, okay? Because this kind of thing was still going on. Every state that you see here that either has lines on it or is in black had sterilization laws on the books. And they were sterilizing people they considered in the 10 groups of the socially unfit. Now, again, those are the ones that are on the books. The number is actually probably a lot greater than that, because some of them a lot of them probably weren't even reported. So that was one way. Another way was through immigration restriction. And so in 1924, the Restriction of Immigration Act put quotas on the number of people that were allowed into the U.S., and people of other races, okay, were less evolved than the Caucasian race, so they did not want them coming in and marrying with the Caucasian people in the United States. So they would even do things like this. So at a eugenic conference, they would put a picture up like this, showing the supposed difference between the size of the brain case between white and black babies, right? Inferring that white babies had bigger brains than black babies, and so that's why white people were smarter than black people. totally untrue, okay? But they're doing this, right? It's just a drawing. It isn't like this is a picture of somebody. They're doing this, again, to try to further their ideas that they wanted to promote, even though they're not true. This was another picture that they would you would see where, again, they show the Caucasian lady in the middle, right? She's looking very serene and stately, and all of the other ethnic groups around her looking quite different, right? They're different. And in this picture, it's interesting, at the bottom it said, "Can the great variety of characteristics that go to make up the different races be safely ignored in tracing the racial history of mankind?" Safely ignored, right? Well, in other words, there's some inherent danger, right, with these people that look differently than us. So that was going on. Another thing that they did, so that was why they had a lot of the immigration restriction, but they also had marriage restriction laws, or anti-miscegenation, which means miscegenation means to mix kind, okay? So they didn't want that going on. Now, a lot of us think about this in relationship to interracial marriage, so-called interracial marriages, but this also would apply to marriage between people that were considered to be defective, right? And the purpose, again, was to keep the Caucasian race pure and to limit the number of defectives. Most states in the U.S. had marriage restriction laws between people at least of different races, and most were not repealed until after 1948. Okay, so this took a while for that to take place. This was a chart that was actually used at the Kansas Fair back again in the early 1900s, and they were trying to show what marriages would produce between the fit and the unfit, okay, with outcomes of pure and abnormal unions, you know? So you would have these people, like if a pure person marries an abnormal person, the children will be tainted, right? And if those tainted children marry abnormal people, well then a lot of their kids are gonna be abnormal. And if you even read on the other side there, it says, "How long are we Americans to be so careful for the pedigree of our pigs and chickens and cattle, and then leave the ancestry of our children to chance or to blind sentiment?" Okay, so again, very much wanting to direct, just like we do for animals, we need to do for mankind so that mankind can evolve into something better and higher. So now that we understand the foundational ideas of eugenics and how those ideas were put into practice, I want to turn our attention to Margaret Sanger, okay, because she is the founder of Planned Parenthood. I want to understand how she and her organization worked to really promote and practice eugenics. Okay, so Margaret Sanger was born in 1879. She was the sixth of 11 children. And early on, she was really committed to the Catholic faith in her early years because her mother was a devout Catholic, but she later became cynical due to her father's influence, and he was an atheist. She married into a wealthy family a couple of times, and she was heavily influenced by Thomas Malthus. Now, he also heavily influenced Charles Darwin in the development of the concept of evolution by natural selection. Malthus was actually concerned that the human population was growing too numerous, and especially the poor, the diseased, the racially inferior, and that they would outgrow natural resources, so we needed to control population. Interestingly enough, this also occurred in the early 70s, okay? We had books that calling for zero population growth, okay? So these ideas have been around for a long time. In a speech that Margaret Sanger gave in 1929 called "The Meaning of Birth Control," she said this: "The practice of birth control raises us to a higher stage in the evolution of life. As each individual progresses, he helps to raise the human race in its evolution forward and onward to higher planes." So again, evolution, right, is the foundation for eugenics and its practices. In order to evolve, in order for mankind to progress, the solutions that was proposed by Malthus's followers, like Sanger and even Darwin and Galton, was to decrease and eliminate the inferior population through birth control. And at this time, a lot of that took place via sterilization, okay? Only later would that be abortion, because abortion was still very tricky because it was considered a surgery and it was challenging to do without antibiotics and things like that back then. But that became more prominent as time went on. So Sanger became one of the foremost champions of birth control, and not just for the seemingly benign reason, which they often say of her and Planned Parenthood, of helping poor women who could not afford large families, but, and this is a quote from her, for the liberation of sexual desire and the new science of eugenics. Okay, so she wanted to be free to do whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted it, with no consequences, so to speak, and to promote this idea of eugenics. And As we'll see, Sanger's views, sadly, were in line with the majority of leading eugenicists of her day. So what she believed was not the exception, but the rule. Sanger published a book in 1922 called The Pivot of Civilization. And for Sanger, the pivot of civilization was birth control. And the book really provided a foundational understanding for what she was trying to accomplish with the American Birth Control League, which she started in 1921, and that later became what we know today as Planned Parenthood. So in this book, she wrote this. She said, "The emergency problem of segregation and sterilization must be faced immediately. Every feeble-minded girl or woman of the hereditary type, especially of the moron class, should be segregated during the reproductive period. Otherwise, she is almost certain to bear imbecile children who in turn are just as certain to breed other defectives." Okay, so she didn't mince words. I mean, I give her credit. She said what she believed at least. And so she was saying they need to be segregated. So these people can't be allowed to marry and have children, okay? Or we don't want them to reproduce because they'll just produce more defectives. She said, moreover, when we realize that each feeble-minded person is a potential source of an endless progeny of defect, we prefer the policy of immediate sterilization and making sure that parenthood is absolutely prohibited to the feeble-minded. So it's not enough to just segregate them, right, and not allow them to reproduce. Let's just sterilize them, right, to make sure that they don't reproduce. And again, those laws were on the books, okay? So this was actually upheld by the government. All right, these are actual laws that they followed. And so Sanger also publicized a lot of her ideas and those of other eugenicists in her magazine called the Birth Control Review. Okay, so that was a publication that she put out. And notice the tagline, birth control to create a race of thoroughbreds. Right? I mean, that's the idea that she's trying to do, is these eugenic ideals to make mankind evolve into something better and higher. And I think the name of the first magazine that she ever published in its tagline really tells us a lot about Sanger's purpose. It was called The Woman Rebel, No Gods, No Masters. Okay, so she placed her authority over God's, right? She wanted to undermine biblical authority. She didn't want to abide by God's views on sex and marriage and the value of life and helping the poor and the crippled and the oneness of the human race. That's very clear from her writings, right? She had no desire to do what the Bible said to do, right? To uphold that authority and what God said in his word. And just as Darwin was a revolutionary in biology, Sanger was a revolutionary when it came to social sciences. And they're connected because she was using his ideas about evolution to further her own ideas about eugenics. And many of her ideas are still prevalent today in society and in the organization that she founded. All right, so we're going to talk about that. Because now that we have a good picture of sort of the history of eugenics and the foundation that it provided for abortion and Planned Parenthood, I want to look at modern eugenics and how it is being carried out today in the form of abortion and genetic screening or editing, okay? Because it's advanced, basically. So when the popularity of eugenics faded out in the 1940s due to the horrors that were associated with Nazis and eugenics, right? Because people saw the horrific extremes to which eugenic ideals could be used, and like what Hitler did, right, with the Jewish people, with other people as well, and they wanted nothing to do with that. They wanted to distance themselves from that. And in addition, the so-called science of eugenics was shown to be false by advances in the field of genetics. So people began to realize, you don't really inherit those things, right? They no longer believe that behavior could be associated with a particular gene, much less somehow quantified, or that genius or intellect was that way, especially with the discovery of the structure of DNA, which would have happened in the early 50s, and advances in the field of genetics. But it didn't die. Okay, and Edwin Black is the author of the book War Against the Weak, and it's a book about this thick, but it is literally one of the most comprehensive books on eugenics. And he said this: while human genetics was becoming established in America, eugenics did not die out. It became quiet and careful. All right. So there has been a resurgence of the eugenic agenda in our modern time, and it's not different in principle or goal, but only different in name and methods. Okay, that's the only thing that has changed. And new technology has led to different methods to accomplish eugenics. All right. So now the focus isn't so much on individuals or persons, but the actual DNA makeup that they have due to advances in the science of genetics. Now, it is amazing how far the science science of genetics has advanced. I mean, I'm a geneticist, so I greatly appreciate that, right? Because it allows us to study things and study them well. And it's now feasible to sequence, screen, and test the DNA of individuals. That's something that people back in the early 1900s had no access to. And these advances in genetics can really have some good uses, okay? We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, right? There are some good uses. Like you can use it for, in other words, what I'm saying is it's not inherently evil or bad. For example, we use it in forensics, okay, to determine whether or not someone committed a crime. We might use it to determine the cause of a disease, which leads to better treatments, right? Or even a cure. To determine genetic predispositions people might have to cancer, okay? So again, they get more regular screening. Those are all good uses of that type of technology. Or even ancestry testing, right? People use it to determine their ethnic background. So those are really good uses for these things, these advances in genetics. But okay, there's always a flip side, right? Because how could that information be used in ways that is bad? Because advances in genetics and analysis has opened up new avenues to pursue eugenic ideals in the 21st century, which is most vividly seen right now in the form of prenatal genetic screening. So this is when they take the baby's DNA from either embryos, like if a woman's having in vitro fertilization done, or through amniocentesis or chorionic villus sampling if the individual is pregnant. And so what happens is the DNA is screened for genetic disorders, chromosome abnormalities, and predispositions to disease. And sadly, many times defective embryos, what they consider defective embryos, are destroyed or babies are aborted as a result of this process. Now again, I'm not saying that genetic screening itself is inherently bad. It can be good. It can help parents and families be prepared and get treatment early, okay? It's amazing. Have you seen some of these surgeries that they do while the baby is still in the womb? I mean, that's amazing. That's neat. That's good. And these can have really good uses. But the problem is what people choose to do with the information that is bad a lot of times, okay? And the prevalence of prenatal genetic screening and the horrible outcomes was highlighted in a story not too long ago on CBS about the so-called eradication of Down syndrome in Iceland. One journalist said this: since prenatal screening tests were introduced in Iceland in the early 2000s, the vast majority of women, close to 100%, who received a positive test for Down syndrome terminated their pregnancy, okay, which is a fancy way of saying they killed their child, okay? That's what they did because they had a positive diagnosis of Down syndrome. Now, I want you to watch this interview that a CBS reporter did with a woman who counsels pregnant women who have had this prenatal genetic screening done at one of Iceland's hospitals, and listen to what she says.
We don't look at abortion as a murder. We look at it as a thing that we ended. We ended a possible life that may have had a huge complication.
You see it as preventing suffering.
Preventing suffering for the child and also for the family. And I think that is more right than seeing it as a murder. It's so black and white. Life isn't black and white. Life is gray.
Okay, so what is she saying? So basically, she believes that murdering the baby, which isn't a baby to her, right? It's just potential life. Did you catch how she said that, right? Potential life is the lesser of two evils, right? It's better to kill the child than to have a child with a disability that is suffering. And in response to this news story, specifically the title of it, that Down syndrome is disappearing, right? One journalist said this: one might be forgiven for assuming that Iceland had developed an innovative treatment for the chromosomal disorder. It turns out Iceland's solution is much simpler and much more sinister. Use prenatal testing and abortion to systematically exterminate children with Down syndrome. This isn't progress, it's eugenics. He's right. He's absolutely right. And it's not just Iceland where this is occurring, right? 90% of women in the United Kingdom who receive a positive Down syndrome diagnosis choose to abort. In the US, that percentage falls somewhere between 67 and 90%. Okay, so this is not just happening in some little, country somewhere else. It's happening all over the world. And as another journalist lamented, it's a slippery slope. If Iceland's policy reflects a relatively heavy-handed genetic counseling, then what will it mean when we have the science to extrapolate on these tests and pinpoint other problematic traits in people? How about children with congenital heart defects or cleft palate or sickle cell disease or autism? Eradicate, right? What's going to happen, right? Who's going to decide? Who's going to make that decision? When man is the authority and man decides, where does it stop? Are we going to have the 10 groups of socially unfit again, like we did in the early 1900s? Will we have 20? Will we have 100? Right? It's just eugenics all over again. It just uses different methods to accomplish the same horrific outcomes. So I want to shift gears, though, and talk about a new form of eugenics that I see developing on the horizon, okay? And that is genetic engineering. 5 years ago, I wasn't really seriously even considering this idea that we could actually do this, but that just shows you how things advance, right, in science. But technological developments have led to the real possibility of human genetic editing through something called CRISPR-Cas9. Now, some of you may have heard of this. It has been very popular in the news. I actually just wrote an article on it for Answers Magazine to help people understand more about it. It's actually part of the bacterial immune system. So bacteria have an immune system as well. They have to fight against viruses because bacteria can get colds too, basically. Okay, they can get viral infections. So it's basically using that technology, that design, right, that God gave to the bacteria to help protect them in a fallen world, so to speak, taking that and using it as a way to do genetic engineering and genetic editing in humans. To specifically, it basically is a very specific system. That's why people like it, okay? So supposedly, it doesn't make a lot of other changes. It just makes the change you want, okay? That's the idea. So it effectively and specifically repairs mutated DNA. And I applaud people that had developed this technique because I think it has a lot of very useful purposes. Again, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, okay? There's a lot of good things that you can use CRISPR for. For example, they actually have used it for screening for certain diseases like the Zika virus and Parkinson's disease, okay? So that's good. You can use it to eliminate infectious disease. There has been some trials that are ongoing to see if we can use it to treat HIV, muscular dystrophy. That's a big one. They've been very successful in treating that in dogs using this system. Liver diseases, okay? So those are good uses. To make better organ donors, okay? Pigs, their organs are actually the closest to ours in size, but they're pigs. So we would tend to reject that. So they want to basically genetically engineer pigs to develop organs that we would not reject, okay? So that's good. You know, those are some really good uses for this system. But then there's also this one, editing human embryos, okay? They have actually done this in the state of Oregon. In human embryos, they fixed a heart gene, a gene that basically causes, when defective, causes hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Now, I always say one of these things is not like the other, okay, when looking at this list. These first three things have applications for humans that do not involve making modifications in their DNA that can be passed on to the next generation. In other words, it would just be for that individual, right? It doesn't get passed on if that individual has children. And again, typically this has been restricted, but even here in the US, they have been successful at editing human embryos. Now, they did not allow these embryos to be placed in a woman and to be born. Sadly, again, they've destroyed these children in a dish, basically. They've destroyed them after they did this, but they were successful at doing it, right? It just shows that this is something that's possible. But in 2018, a Chinese researcher claimed to be the first to gene edit babies, okay? So these parents, again, through this procedure, have had genetically edited twin girls that they tried to make a change basically in their genes that would prevent them from being infected with the HIV virus. And we know for a fact that one of the girls did get that change in her gene, okay? So she essentially can't be infected with HIV. So the research has shown he was successful in making at least some of those changes. So this is a reality that we have to deal with, right? This is no longer hypothetical, it's real. And so because editing a human embryo means changing the DNA that will be passed to the next generation when that individual has children, okay, because they can't pass on a mutation they no longer have, right? Things have been fixed. It is illegal in the US. So the FDA will not approve studies. The NIH will not fund research for this. although that's not the case in other countries, okay, as we've already seen. And so this is something we have to think really carefully about, because we're modifying the human genome, okay, our very DNA, which will be subsequently passed on to future generations. And so obviously we can see that this could be used for a lot of good. In one paper they said it could apply to any more than 10,000 conditions caused by specific inherited mutations, things like Tay-Sachs or thalassemia or Huntington's disease, Alzheimer's, things that we know where the mutation is. And while that sounds great, because all of these things are part of the fall and we're doing our best to correct the effects of the fall, where does it stop, right? What can it lead to? Because changing genes, what about changing genes that may be involved in intellect or athletic abilities or playing a musical instrument? What about changing those genes through genetic editing? And so if man's the ultimate authority, who decides what can and should be changed or not changed, right? That's where we're going to go. Why can't we change things like hair color and eye color and height? Why just limit it to disease? So couldn't this be seen as a way to progress the human race from an evolutionary standpoint, right? Why not use this to make better and better humans, right? We don't have to do it the old-fashioned way, right? Now we'll do it this newfangled way, where we decide and we make those decisions. So that is the problem, right? We're on a slippery slope when man is the ultimate authority. So eugenics is really alive and well in the 21st century. It's just in a lot of new and dangerous ways. Just listen to a few of these modern voices that deal with this issue. James Watson is the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, and he said this: if you're really stupid, I would call that a disease. The lower 10% who really have difficulty, even in elementary school, what's the cause of it? A lot of people would like to say, well, poverty, things like that. It probably isn't. So I'd like to get rid of that to help lower the 10%. All right, so again, he said this, in 2000, he said this like not that long ago, right? Just couple decades ago. He thinks it's genetic, right? Again, these are his words. He thinks people are stupid because of the genes that they inherit, okay? And so he wants to get rid of that. Remember we talked about the submerged tenth, right? It hasn't gone away. It's alive and well. I want you to listen to what this journalist and author, Virginia Ironside, said in an interview on a BBC show in 2011. Listen to this.
If I were a mother of a suffering child, I would be the first to want, a deeply suffering child, I would be the first to want to put a pillow over its face.
Dr. Peter Evans
as I would with any suffering thing. And I think the difference is that my feeling of horror, suffering, is much greater than my feeling of getting rid of a couple of cells, because suffering can go on for years.
I'm sorry, I was just about to introduce another guest there, but that's a pretty horrifying thing to say, that you would put a pillow over there.
Of course I would, if it was a child I really loved who is in agony. I think any good mother would.
That's going to cause some shock amongst people.
I don't know any mother who wouldn't say that if there was nothing else that could be done, and it was
just not true.
Do you think that mothers would agree with you?
I think a lot would. Maybe not any, but a lot.
Okay, think about that. She thinks a lot of people would agree with her. It's okay to put a pillow over your child's head and suffocate them if you deem that they are suffering greatly. Okay, that's where we're at. And it's shocking when you hear this. You can see the other two people there, right? They're just kind of like, whoa, what do we say, right? But in some ways, that's not surprising, because that's the result. When you start with your own authority, right, you determining right and wrong, and not God's word when it comes to the value of life, then it's up to people to decide, right? It's not up to any one book, right? Like the Bible, like God's word, it's up to people. In a book entitled A Century of Eugenics in America, we read this: geneticists often avoid discussions of eugenics, but such avoidance ignores the risk of eugenic resurgence and may in fact foster its reemergence by avoiding notice of the scientific, medical, and social factors that are realigning for the perfect storm. All right, so what are some of the major factors leading to a perfect storm? Where we're going to see more and more of this. Many of the economic and social influences that led to the American eugenics movement back in, again, that we talked about before, in the early 1900s, are present today. And these influences exist in a similar scientific context that is filled with genetic determinism. All right, so what's genetic determinism? That's the idea that our genes determine everything about us. Okay, we're back to where we were again in the early 1900s, right? With that basically your personality, your behavior, your actions, your thoughts were nothing more than the sum of our genes, right? Because according to evolution, there can't be anything other than that. Everything is material. Everything is physical, right? There is no soul. There is no spirit. That's all you are. You're just a bag of chemicals being directed by your gene. And that's exactly what people back in the early 1900s believed, right? They didn't know about genes, but they knew it, what they felt like it was inherited, so to speak. And as much as we'd like to think that's ludicrous, right, to think that things like personality and behavior are determined exclusively by genetics, in other words, that we can't help ourselves, right, that we're just controlled by our DNA, that is what many people are starting to believe again. Again, as more and more people go away from believing in God, right? They're not going to believe that we have a soul or a spirit that lives eternally, right? And so that's what we're left with. And it stems very much from evolutionary ideas that everything is material, so that's all there can be. So you can see where this is heading with genetic screening, right? Because it's eventually going to go way beyond just screening for genetic diseases, right? But also looking at genes that are believed to be related somehow to behaviors, actions, and personalities of people that are just not acceptable to us, right? Things that we think are wrong, maybe criminal behavior, something like that. So that allows society to potentially get rid of those individuals before they're even born, right? So we don't have to deal with that. Why would society want to get rid of those with disease or criminals before they're born rather than trying to help them after they're born, right? What does it all come down to? Well, they said this: I would like to suggest that in the U.S., immersed as we are in the present economic era of cutbacks and bottom line mentality, we are on the brink of revisiting a mistake of the past that is regarding certain people as too expensive to maintain and using genetic arguments to justify inhumane solutions in the name of efficiency. Money, right? Plus genetic determinism, they're creating the perfect storm. Because what do you think happens many times when the government is in control of healthcare? Right? When the government has to pay for the expensive care of the so-called defective individuals that don't contribute to society, right? Will it do so? Nope, right? And it's already happening, right? I've read story after story of individuals who said they've been denied, okay, certain types of medication that could help them, but it's too expensive, right? And so they'll deny them that, and these individuals die, right, as a result, even though they could have lived. But it's all about money, right? And that's what it boils down to, sadly. And Planned Parenthood, honestly, as the largest abortion provider in the world, has been there all along, right? They haven't gone away. They still keep doing what they're doing, aiding and advancing eugenics, both in the past and the present, and I believe it will continue to do so in the future. You should take a look sometime at a map of where Planned Parenthood clinics are located. It's very telling, right, what they're trying to do, right? And that those ideas are still alive and well. They're all for prenatal genetic screening and things like that. They're all for telling women to get rid of their children if they're somehow defective or have an abnormality, right? That they do those things all the time. And so we need to realize that's something that's not just people can go and have done. Even our tax money is paying for things like that, sadly, okay? And that's what it's becoming, so we need to be aware of that. So when we start with man's ideas, apart from God, apart from the Bible, this is the outcome, right? A belief that human life only has value if we can positively contribute to society in some way and not drain societal resources and not burden others for their care. It's what I would call a very pragmatic or utilitarian approach to life. Only when we start with God's word do we have a basis for things like the sanctity of all human life, regardless of ability or disability, that marriage should only be between a man and a woman, and other moral absolutes, versus starting with man's word, where everything is permissible, and a very pragmatic, utilitarian approach to life. And we have to be careful ourselves, too, when it comes to this debate. Just a little sidebar here. I've heard a lot of times when people are pro-life and trying to support, laws against abortion and things like that. I've heard, you've probably heard it too. They'll say, "Oh, but what if the person, that you're aborting, the baby you're aborting, grew up to be the next Beethoven, right, or the next great world leader?" You know what? That you're using a pragmatic, utilitarian approach yourself, right? If you agree with those things, it doesn't matter if the baby grows up to be Beethoven or a world leader, right? That's That's not the point. The point is that this is an individual made in the image of God. And that is why that life is valuable and should be saved, right? And should be allowed to live. It has nothing to do with what that individual will do or will not do in life, but merely that they are an image bearer, right? That they are a human life and should be valued above all else. So we have to remember that. So that's why we have to build our foundation on the authority and truthfulness of God's word, because it is the ultimate authority when it comes to the value of life. Everything else is arbitrary, okay? We have to realize that. So what does Scripture have to say about the value of human life? That people are made in the image of God and they are valued by God, right? We know that starting in Genesis, that God made man and woman in his image. We are all image bearers, and we are that from the moment of fertilization, right? That is when you have a unique human being and that they are made in the image of God. In Jeremiah, we read, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctify you." God forms us in the womb. He knew us before we were born. He has a plan for our lives, just like Jeremiah. He sanctified him and ordained him as a prophet. And that's, if you think about it, that's very much in contrast to the eugenic ideals that certain individuals are a drain on society and never contribute, right? God has a purpose and plan for every life, no matter how long or how short that life may be. And that's further confirmed by the psalmist. "For you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. My frame was not hidden from you." And human life, if you think about it, is so valuable to God that he sent his son to die for us, right? That's how valuable it is. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. All people are one race. We're all descendants of Adam and Eve. So there's no basis for racism, right? God created Adam and then he made Eve from Adam's side, and she was the mother of all the living, right? We're one race, the human race. And we see that again in Acts 17:26. He has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth. So there's no basis for the eugenic ideal of racism, okay? That's out the door. And this is important to the gospel because it says, "For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive." Because we all descend from Adam and Eve. We're all sinners, right? Which is why we need the salvation that Christ offered. For we are all one, right? There's no Jew or Greek or slave or free or male or female. We're all one in Christ Jesus. It doesn't matter what our skin shade is or whether we're deaf or blind or what it may be. If we receive Christ, we function as one in Christ. Christians are to care for the sick and the needy, right? I mean, that really goes against eugenic ideals. They would say, no, let him die, right? Let nature take its course. But no, it says in Exodus, "You shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress them, not afflict any widow or fatherless child." We're to take care of people, right? Even if they're from another people group, strangers in the land, those without spouses, those without parents. And that's reiterated again in Jesus' words in Matthew. He commands us to care for the hungry, the sick, the poor, and the criminals. And so that's very much in stark contrast to the eugenic ideals of wanting to rid society of these very same people. Suffering has a purpose in a fallen world, right? So the fact that we have babies are born with disease or defects sometimes is because we live in a fallen world. It says, "In the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider. Surely God has appointed the one as well as the other," right? So God is sovereign. He is in complete control. He is good, and therefore he cannot do anything that is not good. He does have a plan and a purpose for everything in our lives. It is always for our good and for his glory, right? Even when it doesn't make sense and even when we can't understand it, we have to believe that because we know who God is from his word. What did God say to Moses, right? "Who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord?" Remember the blind man that Jesus healed? He said, because they were saying, "Oh, what sin did he commit? What about his parents?" He said, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him." It's for God's glory and our good. Somehow, some way, that's what it's for. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. That is a promise for believers, okay? God has a plan for our good and his glory. And I truly believe that those with disabilities and disease have much to teach us and to help us know and understand God in a way that we could not learn in a fallen world, maybe only in a very limited way. I think they really can help us understand that better. I'm very thankful for some of our family friends, the McKeevers, And their little boy, Kieran, which is shown here with my daughter, Elizabeth, picture taken a few years ago, he has something called Williams syndrome, all right? And so part of one of his chromosomes is missing. And people with Williams syndrome are extremely sociable. They basically love to love, right? That's what they do. And he has taught us so many things, but probably most importantly, how to love unconditionally. And it's an amazing earthly picture of Christ's love for us, right? And by knowing him, we get to understand that more and that better. And we need to realize that only Jesus can bring about a new heaven and a new and a perfect heaven and earth. Eugenicists are really seeking to bring about utopia in a lot of ways. They want to wipe out crime and disease so man can evolve into something higher and better. But from a biblical perspective, that is an unattainable goal, right? Because we live in a fallen world, and only Jesus can bring about a perfect world. And he can bring that into existence and perfect us. And he will do so in the consummation when we have a new heaven and a new earth. And there's no more sorrow or crying or pain or death or curse, right? So perfection's only going to come through Jesus, right? People want to try to do that here on earth, but they'll never be successful. We live in a sin-cursed world. We are all a bunch of mutants, okay? We've got 6,000 years worth, okay? That's happened since the fall. That's just the way things are. For some people, it's just more obvious on the outside than others, right? We're all deteriorating. That's what's happened. But nonetheless, God has given us life in this sin-cursed world to glorify him. So life is valuable to God, right? No matter how short or how impaired that life may be. And contrary to the ideas supported by eugenics and abortion advocates, all human life has value because it comes from the life giver to bring glory to him, right? So let us open our mouths for the speechless, right? In the cause of all who are appointed to die. Open our mouths, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and the needy, right? We need to be active in doing that. And so I want to help you know how you can have some more resources to help you on this. If you're here at the Creation Museum today, I hope that you take a lot of time to go through our brand new Fearfully and Wonderfully Made exhibit. Again, detailing how that life develops in the womb and how that life is an image bearer from the moment of fertilization, right? And has great value. And so we did that exhibit because we want people to truly understand that. And we have some great resources to help you with that. We have a newsletter. This comes out once a month. It's free. You can sign up online or at answersinsider.com. Encourage you to do that because it's a great way to stay up to date with everything that's happening at the Creation Museum, the Ark Encounter, and Answers in Genesis. So for example, you may see some of the construction going on in the Palm Plaza. That will be our permanent Fearfully and Wonderfully Made exhibit. It's going to double in size, okay? So we're really excited about being able to offer that. We have what we call the Sanctity of Life box set. And in that, I do have a presentation. I have a DVD, a presentation I gave called Eugenics, Abortion, and Genetics. And it has a lot of the material I presented today plus more, okay, in that. It's a little bit longer presentation. This set also covers things like the development of the baby in the womb, information on stem cells, cloning, suicide, death and suffering in this world. So it's really a great set if you want to learn more about all those things from a biblical perspective. Also, my good friend Camille Cates a few years ago, she gave a presentation on abortion and finding hope and healing. So she had an abortion and had another child die. And so she really has a great grasp on this particular topic and helping people and helping women heal from abortions. And so she has that DVD. It's part of our box set, Embrace Complete set. You can buy it individually or part of this women's conference we had a few years ago dealing with even my good friend Stacia McKeever, who I mentioned earlier, her little boy I showed the picture of. She had the DVD in here on disability and understanding that better. So that's a great DVDs to understand that better. How can a loving God, dealing with that issue of death and suffering, how do we understand that God is loving, but yes, we do live in a fallen world, and he is in complete control, and everything is for our good and his glory. And this book will help you learn more about that. Also, the race issue. Again, this is important because although I didn't delve into it real deeply, we'll have some other presentations later this week that will go into that more, dealing with that race issue. Eugenicists wanted to purify, the Caucasian race. That was one thing they definitely wanted to do. So it's important to understand that we're all one race, one blood. And so that book looks at it from a biblical and a scientific perspective. And then this book takes that material and helps kids understand it, right? Because we want kids that aren't racist as well. The Lie of Evolution in Millions of Years by our CEO, Ken Ham. This is the textbook of our ministry, next to the Bible, which is first and foremost. Again, helping us understand these issues, right? So we're seeing how a belief in evolution led to eugenics, right? That's one outcome of it. And there are plenty more, right, that we see in our culture today. The answers books 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then A Flood of Evidence, that's sort of our 5th answers book, has over 150 questions on creation, evolution, social issues. Where did Cain get his wife? How do you know day means a day? What about the race issue, the flood, the ark? And in the new answers book 3, the yellow one up there, I actually have a chapter on what I talked about today. Okay, so it has some information on that, summarizes a lot of those things. We also have a version of those answers books for teens as well as for children, because we want everyone to be equipped to be able to give an answer for the hope that's in us. We have our YouTube special here. You want to look for books, DVDs, and CDs that have a little green dot on them to make that package for your family. Our brand, we have the issue of our magazine right now, Answers Magazine, actually focuses on our Fearfully and Wonderfully Made exhibit. So it has some great details about how that exhibit came to be and the work that went into that, the lifelike models that were made, so you can find out more about that. So if you subscribe today, you get the digital subscription for free, as well as you get a free DVD for every year that you sign up. So take advantage of that. I love this magazine because it's all about how do we look at the world from a biblical worldview, right? How do we approach it? And there really is something for everybody. There's a kids section in it with lots of great activities for them, which we recently expanded, so lots for everyone in the family. Our Begin book is great for new believers or unbelievers. It has portions of Scripture, beginning in Genesis, going all the way to Revelation with some commentary to kind of tie it all together. And then what does it mean to be saved, and answers to 10 most asked questions. I call it the Bible in a nutshell, okay, because that's really what it is. And so that's available for $3 out here in Legacy Hall. We have our pocket guides available for $2 each. Also, we have a brand new streaming service that we started just last year called Answers.tv. It has over 3,000 videos on it. Family-friendly streaming service, right? There's a novel idea. So you can sit down and watch things without having to worry about it. And all brand new programming, as well as we partner with other ministries to offer their programming. So really something for everybody, kids, adults, teens. There's conferences, kids programs, adventure programs, creationist nature programs, right? There's something you don't see very often. Music programs, science experiments, homeschool material, lots of great things. You can get it on all those apps as well that you might watch on your TV. So I encourage you to check that out. It's a great streaming service. It's only $3.99 a month, okay? And we're adding more stuff to it all the time. We also have our women's conference coming out next month, just in a few weeks here. Answers for Women, Truth, Uncovering the Lies We Believe. We are sold out at this point, but we do have a waiting list. So if you're interested in attending in person, you can get on that wait list. We are also going to be streaming it through Answers.tv. So it's basically 2.5 days conference. And so I encourage you to go to answersforwomen.org to find out more information about that. We have a great lineup of speakers, and you can purchase the stream of that and show it to your church, your ladies group, whatever it might be, and take advantage of that conference. Well, I'm out of time for today, but if you have any questions or comments, just give me a few minutes to get down here by the piano, and I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.